Imagine how, in ancient times, in the days of the glorious city of Rome, when the calendar showed the year 67 from the birth of Christ, you walk along the stone streets of the Forum. The sun high in the sky casts shadows from the marble columns, and on the horizon appears the figure of the ruler of the empire himself, Nero. He walks with a young beauty, decorated with silver and gold, silk from distant lands. Mysterious whispers wander through the crowd, because everyone knows, this woman is not who she seems. Once she was a boy named Sporus, and what the emperor did to him will forever go down in history as an act of terrible enslavement and abuse, both spiritual and physical. But before I unroll the scroll of this terrible story, let me say, if you like to discover the secrets of hoary antiquity, do not forget to share your opinion and tell us where you are listening to this story. It is wonderful that you and I, although from different corners of the world, are united by a curiosity for the past that overcomes space and time. This tale is not an ordinary tale about the whims of the powerful. It is a story about how omnipotence can spoil love, turn longing into madness, and a person into a living doll created to satisfy the distorted imagination of a tyrant. The name Sporus is hardly familiar to most, but once you learn about his fate, it will be difficult to forget it. But we should not start with him, but with the one who became the architect of the tragedy. Nero was not always cruel. On the contrary, his youth inspired hope. When he took the throne at the age of 16, the townspeople hoped for a new golden age. He reduced taxes, financed spectacles, and himself performed on stage, moving the common people. But excessive power is poison. It crept into the soul, and by the year 65 after Christ, something in Nero had changed irrevocably. Perhaps it was suspicion, because around him were the most ambitious rivals. Perhaps loneliness, because he was the only one whom no one dared to contradict. Or perhaps the reason lies in the loss of the one he considered the most dear, Poppaea Sabina. She embodied for him the feminine ideal, unprecedented beauty, extraordinary intelligence, and ambition. But Poppaea was not just an ornament at court. She had a political cunning that many senators could envy. At the time of meeting her, Nero already had a wife, Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor. But that marriage was cold, without passion. And here Poppaea appears, the living embodiment of everything that Octavia lacked. Octavia, silent, aloof. Poppaea, graceful, proud, magnetic. Their relationship began as a banal intrigue, but it quickly grew into something painful. Nero did not just desire Poppaea, he fantasized about her. His advisors were stunned by his obsessive obsession. Outbursts of anger, guards following her every step, countless gifts, from Indian gems to Oriental incense. All this testified to the loss of reason. But the main thing was something else. He began to reshape reality to suit his own whims. He broke off his marriage with Octavia, which shocked society, and announced that he was taking Poppaea as his wife in a solemn ceremony. The wedding was grand, full of luxury never seen in the empire before. But even sacred vows could not satisfy the hunger of Nero's soul. He did not desire a woman. He desired to possess the essence of Poppaea. Removing her from her loved ones, he surrounded her with subordinates who owed everything to him. He ordered the creation of dozens of images, bas-reliefs and portraits, so that her face would never disappear from his sight. Chroniclers write that sometimes Nero would contemplate her for hours, as an artist contemplates a masterpiece, and not a man a beloved. His love lost its human face, turning into a cruel domination over the body and spirit of a woman. For him, she was not a person, but an object of worship, property that was only supposed to decorate his universe. But Poppaea understood who she was dealing with. Her cleverness allowed her to maneuver in the court storms. She used the emperor's favor to strengthen her family, building her own political network, but did not lose vigilance. After all, the slightest hesitation of Nero could destroy everything. She was not afraid to contradict the ruler. She refused to remain silent when his decisions harmed the empire. She mocked his poetic efforts, criticized him for his irresponsibility. And then, on a day that is not marked in the chronicles as solemn, but as fatal, everything changed. In the summer of the 65th year after the birth of Christ, an ordinary, as it seemed, dispute broke out. Some said, because Nero returned late from the races. Others, because of the theater. But what happened next? Almost all sources agree. The emperor's anger overflowed. Poppaea, then pregnant, reproached him. They say, he cares about his fame more than about his family. And at that moment, driven by blind rage, Nero struck her. One blow, or many, the sources differ. But the consequence was the same, a terrible internal trauma. Imagine the moment when he realized what he had done. A man who had power over 30 legions, who could decide the fate of anyone with a word, had killed the one he considered the heart of his world. The descriptions of what happened next border on madness. The emperor throws himself on her body, cries, prays, orders her to live, as if he could force death to yield by his power. Doctors were summoned from all over the capital, promised riches, and at the same time threats, if they did not save her. But the heavens were silent. And a few hours later Poppaea departed to another world, carrying with her an unborn child. And what was broken in Nero's heart then could no longer be mended. His grief became a legend. But it was not just suffering, it was a break with the real world. He refused to burn her body, as custom dictated. Instead, he ordered her embalmed and buried in a tomb that surpassed the monuments of his predecessors. The emperor declared her divine, created a cult of her name, addressed her dead body as if she heard him. And the entire court had to participate in this performance. Address her as if she were alive, leave her place at banquets, do not mention new feelings or other women. It was at this time, when Nero's madness reached its apogee, that Sporus appeared in his life. The one who did not yet know that he was destined to become part of a terrible tragedy. Sporus, then a young man, had barely entered the prime of life. He was hardly more than 14 or 15 years old. Born a slave, but later freed, he lived within the walls of the imperial palace, where he received an education that prepared him for service in the household. Many of these freedmen lived better than ordinary citizens, but at the same time were completely dependent on the favor of their freedmen. This dependence placed them in a terrible vulnerability. One word, and you are in glory. Another, and you are in prison or worse. And this was exactly the position Sporus found himself in when Nero first drew his attention to him. What caught the emperor's eye was not the boy's mind or his abilities, but his face. Historians of the time speak of Sporus's uncanny resemblance to the late Poppaea, especially the eyes and graceful features. In the Roman worldview, external resemblance meant spiritual kinship. And when Nero saw in the boy an echo of his beloved, he may have believed that he saw the embodied soul of the deceased. The emperor, speaking to a dead body, believed that he had the power to bring back the deceased. His clouded consciousness saw no obstacles. Sporus's gender is male, but what is that to someone who imagines himself a deity? Thus begins one of the darkest chapters in the legends about the cruelty of the powerful. Nero decided not to simply dress Sporus in women's clothes. He ordered a terrible operation to be performed on him in order to permanently change his body. Doctors were summoned to the palace, the best that the empire could offer. And although the medicine of those times was extremely primitive, they were instructed to do the impossible, to deprive the young man of his male nature. What happened did not just disfigure him physically. It was an attempt to destroy him as a person. The procedure was extremely painful and deadly. It was carried out in specially prepared rooms, among marble walls that did not hear mercy. Sporus, defenseless, lay under the hands of doctors, pressed by servants, and his screams were lost in the void. But the young man survived. And after long weeks of torment and healing, the world heard a new name, Sabina. So Nero baptized him, in honor of his deceased wife, whose image was now to live in Sporus. Another preparation began, no longer medical, but theatrical. The seamstresses of the empire sewed dresses that masked the features of the young body. Jewelers made jewelry in which they mounted precious stones that once belonged to Poppaea. And every pearl that touched Sporus's skin seemed to attach fragments of someone else's soul to him. Makeup artists taught him to paint his face, to change his cheekbones, eyes, and lips with paints. The training lasted for days, because every detail was important. And not only his appearance. Sporus had to learn to move like a woman, to walk softly, sit gracefully, speak softly. Even his voice had to be changed. The mentors trained the young man to pronounce words more delicately, more softly, as Roman women of the upper classes did. And what was most terrible, all this was done not for a role in a play, but for life. which had now become a role. Imagine looking in the mirror every morning and seeing a face that was not your own, repeating movements that were not your own every day, to speak in other words than his own, to breathe someone else's life. The young man who had his own dreams and aspirations had disappeared. All that remained was a living copy of Poppaea, animated by the imagination of the one who considered himself a god. The wedding was scheduled for spring, during the holidays, so that it would acquire religious significance. The palace was transformed into a temple of luxury. Lamps illuminated the hall, where songs sounded, wines flowed like a river, and everyone pretended that this was a real holy union. Sporus, dressed in royal robes, behaved like a real empress. The ceremony took place according to all the laws, the exchange of vows, bread, the signing of scrolls. And although the faces of those present retained smiles, horror swirled in their souls. After the marriage ceremony, Nero began to treat Sporus as if Poppaea had truly risen before him. The young man received his own chambers in the palace complex, servants, guards, and generous funds from the imperial treasury. He was given a litter to move around the city, horses for outings, and a retinue that was to accompany him as the legitimate ruler of Rome. But behind the glitter of gold was hidden a terrible price. Sporus lost the last remnants of his own nature. He was required not just to look like a woman, but to live like Poppaea. At banquets, he sat next to Nero, smiled, answered the addresses of dignitaries, and played the role of a faithful wife, having no room for error. It was not just theater for the crowd. The emperor himself believed in the fictional reality. He called Sporus by the name of the deceased, recalled shared moments that never existed, and waited for answers that supported the illusion. The young man had to remember fictional memories, react to the events of the past, as if he had experienced them himself. Every day was a test. One unsuccessful look, word, or gesture could cost him his life. Historians testify that over time, Sporus learned to feel the emperor's mood with amazing subtlety, to anticipate his anger and satisfy his expectations. But at the same time, he became more and more silent, sadder, like a shadow that exists only thanks to the light of another. His rooms were decorated in such a way as to remind him of Poppaea. In the mirrors, he saw not himself, but an image created for the pleasure of someone else's madness. Every decoration, every dress, every word reminded him that his own life no longer belonged to him. More than 2 years passed like this, and when the emperor decided to go to Greece, where he wanted to become famous as a great singer and actor, Sporus had to accompany him. Before the Greek nobles, Nero demonstrated his empress, demanding that everyone recognize this farce as the truth. Imagine the surprise and hidden horror of foreigners who saw the ruler of the world next to a young man in women's clothing, and had to pretend not to notice the obvious. But fear of Roman power forced them to remain silent. However, patience in the empire itself broke out. By the 68th year after the birth of Christ, uprisings broke out one after another. The provincial governors, tired of the disorder and disregard for state affairs, raised the banners of rebellion. The Praetorian Guard refused to support the emperor, and the Senate declared him an enemy of the state. When Nero fled Rome with a handful of faithful, Sporus was among them. Even at the moment of death, the emperor could not part with the living embodiment of his obsessive loss. They took refuge in a country villa, where Nero vacillated between dreams of salvation and thoughts of his own death. When news of the approaching enemy became imminent, Nero chose suicide. His death liberated the empire, but for Sporus it was the beginning of a new horror.